It started as a quiet evening. A church stood still under the glow of streetlights, its doors locked, its sanctuary empty. Inside, the air was heavy, but outside, no one suspected a thing. Not the neighbors, not the congregation, not even the people who had walked past its entrance just moments before. But behind those closed doors, something was happening. Something no sermon could prepare for. The man who had once stood at the pulpit, who had prayed for others, who had counseled the lost, he was now struggling to breathe. His hands were tied, his body was bruised, and in the last moments of his life, he wasn't met with mercy, but with cruelty. When morning came, the locks hadn't been forced, the windows hadn't been shattered, the church doors still stood intact, but inside, a crime so brutal had taken place that even seasoned detectives would later say, this was not the work of a desperate man. This was something else entirely. The victim, a respected pastor. The survivor, a church assistant who barely made it out alive. And the man responsible, a name no one would recognize until it was too late. He's not breathing. Please hurry. There's blood everywhere. Oh my God, I think he's gone. A brutal attack, a twisted motive, and a courtroom moment that left everyone in shock. But the question remains why? And what kind of man could do this? Stay with me, because this story, it doesn't end the way you think it does. March 3rd, 2011. The morning sun rose over Arlington, Texas, casting a pale light on the quiet streets of the city. Nothing about this morning would suggest that, in just hours, a family would lose their loved one and a community would lose its guiding force. At New Light Baptist Church, Pastor Jalen Whitaker was not just a spiritual leader. He was a father figure to many. He was known for his devotion to his congregation, his willingness to lend an ear, and his ability to provide comfort when it was most needed. The members of his church looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, and for hope. But behind the walls of his church, hope would soon give way to horror. That morning, Pastor Whitaker's office was locked. The door, usually open to anyone seeking counsel or prayer, was now sealed tight. It wasn't until one of the church's employees, a close friend of Pastor Whitaker, arrived for work that the reality of what was about to unfold began to take shape. When the employee arrived, the church was still locked, concerned. They tried calling the pastor, no answer. A sense of unease crept in. They called again, nothing. It wasn't like him to miss a service. They knew something was wrong. The doors were forced open. What they found inside would change everything. Inside, the church smelled of something foul. Not the usual scent of incense or freshly polished wood, but something much heavier, much darker. And there, in the dim light of his office, Pastor Jalen Whitaker lay motionless, bound, his hands tied, a plastic bag wrapped tightly around his neck, his body bruised and battered. No longer the man who had once stood at the pulpit with warmth in his eyes, but a broken, lifeless figure. But Pastor Whitaker wasn't alone. In a corner, hidden from view at first, was Denise Holloway, his church assistant. She was critically injured, bloodied, barely alive, but still clinging to whatever shred of life was left. Denise had been there, but had she been a witness? Or was she another victim of the violence that struck without warning? The authorities were called in, their investigation swift, but what they found was far from simple. No signs of forced entry, no clear motive, nothing that could explain the brutality of what had taken place in that small, sacred space. A man of faith, an innocent assistant, 2 lives shattered, and no answers. The police arrived soon after the discovery. The usual protocol began, securing the scene, processing the evidence, taking statements. But even the most experienced officers felt the unease that gripped the air. Something about this crime felt different. There was no obvious connection to the church's activities, no history of threats. Everything was supposed to be normal, but normal was far from what the investigators would uncover. News outlets across Arlington quickly picked up the story. Local reporters swarmed the area. Cameras flashed, capturing the eerie stillness of the church, a building that, hours ago, had been the heartbeat of a vibrant community. Now it was a crime scene, and the questions multiplied faster than the answers. Real footage from the crime scene shows a slow, methodical walkthrough of the church, its pristine pews now a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded. Police reports, images of the crime scene, and shattered glass windows painted a picture of desperation, of a life lost too soon. But those images only raise more questions. How could something so violent happen in a place that was meant to offer peace? A beloved pastor, an innocent assistant, 2 lives stolen. But what was the real reason behind it? Who was capable of such a brutal act? And why the church? Was this a random act of violence? Or was there something deeper at play? Something buried beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed? In the coming days, the investigation would uncover a story far more complex than anyone could have imagined. And Pastor Whitaker's death would not remain the isolated incident it first appeared to be. Before March 3rd, 2011, Marquez Langston was already a name known to law enforcement in Arlington, Texas. Not for acts of kindness, not for anything that might have signaled redemption. His name sat in police records, buried among reports of violence, threats, and crimes that seemed to escalate with every passing year. Born and raised in the city, Langston's early life was marked by instability. His mother, a woman who worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads, tried to hold things together. His father was absent, and in that absence, something took hold of Langston, a darkness, a rage, something that would only grow as the years went on. By the time he was a teenager, teachers had long given up on him. His school records told a familiar story. Fights, suspensions, warnings about violent outbursts. He wasn't just another troubled kid. He was something else. The kind of person who didn't seem to care about consequences, who didn't flinch when faced with authority. The kind of person who looked straight through you, as if you weren't even there. By 18, he had his first criminal charge, a robbery that ended in a brutal assault. He and 2 others had followed a man home from a gas station, beaten him in his driveway, and taken everything he had. The victim, left unconscious, barely survived. Langston, he spent 2 years in prison, but when he got out, he was different. Prison didn't rehabilitate him. It refined him. Whatever anger had simmered beneath the surface was now fully formed. His arrest continued, drug charges, illegal possession of firearms, assault. But what made Langston different wasn't just the violence. It was the way he carried himself. There was no fear, no hesitation, and no remorse. Arlington police officers knew his name. So did business owners, neighbors, and anyone who had the misfortune of crossing his path. His reputation wasn't built on words. It was built on actions. The kind that left people afraid to look him in the eye. Then came the connection, the part of the story that no one saw coming, the part that made everything clear. Langston didn't just choose New Light Baptist Church at random. He knew exactly where he was going that night, and he knew exactly who would be there. Some say he had been watching the church for weeks, that he had sat in the back of the Sunday service, quiet, unnoticed. Others say he had visited before, casing the building, looking for something or someone. But the truth was worse, because Pastor Jalen Whitaker knew Langston, and Langston knew him. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. This wasn't about money or robbery. It was something else, something that had been building long before that night. And the more investigators looked into Langston's past, the more they realized this wasn't the first time. There was another victim, another crime, another life stolen, a case that had been left unsolved, forgotten, buried in the system. And now, for the first time, someone was finally asking the question, what did Marquez Langston do before he walked into that church? The crime scene inside New Light Baptist Church left no doubt. Whoever had been inside that night hadn't planned to walk away unnoticed. Blood spattered the walls. Broken furniture lay scattered across the office, and in the center of it all, Pastor Jalen Whitaker's body lifeless, a plastic bag still clinging to his face. But amid the chaos, detectives found something else. Something that would break the case wide open. A single fingerprint on the pastor's desk. A print that didn't belong to the victim, his assistant, or anyone from the congregation. Within hours, it came back with a match. A name law enforcement knew all too well. Marquez Langston. It didn't stop there. In the wreckage of the office, investigators found more. Langston's fingerprints on the doorframe, the light switch, the pastor's chair. His presence was everywhere, imprinted into the crime scene like a signature he never bothered to hide. But it was what detectives found next that erased any doubt. A pair of sneakers, abandoned behind the church, the soles still damp with blood. Lab tests confirmed it, Jalen Whitaker's blood. The size? A perfect match to Langston. Even still, prosecutors knew a conviction needed more. A jury needed more, and they wouldn't have to wait long to find it. Because less than 4 hours after the murder, Marquez Langston was already making his next move. This time, caught on camera, footage from a nearby convenience store showed Langston standing at the counter, swiping a credit card. The cashier, unaware, handed him a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of soda. The name on the card? Jalen Whitaker. For police, it was the final piece of the puzzle. And now, all they had to do was find him. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after the crime, an anonymous tip led officers to an apartment complex just 1 mile from the church. When they arrived, there was no need for a chase. Langston was already outside, sitting on the steps, smoking, waiting. He looked up, saw the flashing lights, and did something no one expected. He smiled. As officers approached, guns drawn, he didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his hands, as if this had all been inevitable, as if none of it mattered. But it was what happened next, inside the interrogation room, that left even the most seasoned detectives shaken. When Marquez Langston walked into the courtroom, he wasn't the picture of a man facing death. He wasn't anxious, he wasn't afraid. If anything, he seemed entertained. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a clear picture. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated, brutal. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, blood, surveillance footage. And yet, as the charges were read, Langston sat back in his chair, relaxed, smiling. It was the same expression he wore when the victim's family took the stand. Jalen Whitaker's wife, his brother, his congregation, all pleading for justice. Their voices shook, their grief still raw. But Langston, he leaned forward, watching them like they were performers in a show meant just for him. And then he laughed. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Every time the prosecution laid out another piece of evidence, another damning detail, there it was. A smirk, a chuckle. At one point, when a forensic expert described the injuries Pastor Whitaker suffered, Langston turned to his defense attorney and whispered something. Witnesses in the gallery would later recall the way his lawyer stiffened, the way her face paled. And when she refused to repeat his words, Langston did it for her, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. That part was my favorite. Gasps filled the room. A woman sobbed. A juror turned away, covering their mouth. But Langston, he just sat back and stretched, as if he was bored of it all. The defense did what they could. They spoke of his childhood, an absent father, a mother in and out of rehab. They pointed to his past, the years of neglect, the warning signs that no one paid attention to. But if they hoped for sympathy, they wouldn't find it here. Not from the jury, not from the judge, because the facts were undeniable. And Marquez Langston, he made sure no one ever forgot it. On February 17, 2012, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. And when the judge handed down the sentence, death, Langston's reaction was immediate. He clapped. He actually clapped. And then he turned to the victim's family. One last time, "I'll see y'all soon." But even behind bars, Marquez Langston wasn't finished. His time on death row was just beginning. Most inmates on death row keep a low profile. They count the days, file appeals, and hope for a sentence reduction. Marquez Langston wasn't like most inmates. In the months leading up to his trial, authorities placed him in a maximum security facility under strict supervision. He was a known risk, aggressive, unpredictable, but even behind bars, he found ways to remind people who he was. November 3rd, 2011, just 8 months after his arrest, a brutal attack inside his cell block left another inmate dead. Surveillance footage captured the moments before it happened. Langston standing motionless in the middle of the common area, staring down a man named Devin Ricks, a convicted armed robber serving a life sentence. Ricks hesitated, backing away, but Langston stepped forward. A single phrase was caught on tape. Seconds later, chaos. By the time guards pulled them apart, Ricks was unresponsive. The autopsy report detailed a crushed windpipe, blunt force trauma, and multiple fractures. Langston, however, walked away without so much as a scratch. With that, another murder charge was added to his record. But if authorities hoped it would change his fate, they were wrong. It only cemented it. Over the next 13 years, Marquez Langston's name remained a problem inside the Texas State Penitentiary. Guards reported violent outbursts, sudden attacks. He tested every limit, every restriction. On more than one occasion, he was placed in solitary confinement for weeks at a time. But even there, he found a way to make himself known. Notes slid under cell doors. Messages scrawled into the walls. A promise he repeated over and over. "I'll see y'all soon." But time doesn't wait. And in the end, neither did the state of Texas. After years of legal battles, Langston's final appeal was denied in January 2025. The execution was set. February 5th midnight. The witnesses were seated. The floor was placed. And as the warden gave the signal, Langston was asked if he had any last words. A long pause. A deep breath. Then, the same smirk he'd worn all those years ago in court. "I am at peace. Let's ride, warden." At 12:04 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. His body went still. His breath slowed. And at 12:11 a.m., Marquez Langston was pronounced dead. No remorse. No apologies. Just silence. Some cases fade over time. This one never did. March 3rd, 2011, changed everything for the congregation of New Light Baptist Church. The place that had once been a refuge became something else entirely. Attendance dropped. The doors remained locked after sundown. Some members never returned. Others sat in those pews every Sunday, staring at the very spot where Pastor Jalen Whitaker had taken his last breath. His wife, Monique Whitaker, spoke at his funeral before a packed church. Her voice didn't waver. Her words were clear. "Jalen always told me that faith is easy when life is good, but real faith is what you hold on to when life isn't fair." Fair or not, life moved forward. But for Denise Holloway, it would never be the same. The last thing she remembered that night was the sound of her own heartbeat, too loud, too fast, as she lay bleeding on the church floor. They told her she was lucky, that she had survived something no one should have walked away from. But surviving isn't the same as living. For years, she avoided cameras, refused interviews. The nightmares never stopped. Even in her sleep, she could still hear his voice. The same voice that had laughed when she begged for her life. She moved away, changed her name. Some wounds heal, others just get buried. Was justice truly served? Or did Marquez Langston win by never showing an ounce of regret? The case of Marquez Langston is over. The sentence was carried out. The headlines have moved on. But some questions never fade. Was Langston a man born to kill, destined to take lives no matter the circumstances? Or was he a product of a system that failed him long before he ever stepped foot in that church? If something had been different, his childhood, his choices, his second chances, would this story have ended another way? Or was there never another path for him? And beyond that, do you believe justice was served? Or was his execution just another moment in a cycle that never really ends? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more cases like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time